My father-in-law thought my addiction history made me unbelievable, so I let my sobriety prove him wrong. Dennis Thornton sat across from me in his home office, with his hands folded on the mahogany desk, and that practiced expression of concern on his face. The same expression I had seen him use 1,000 times when he wanted to appear compassionate while destroying someone. My wife Rachel was standing behind him with her arms crossed, and I could see she was already choosing sides before I even opened my mouth. I had come to tell them what I had discovered at Thornton Recovery Center, the addiction treatment facility Dennis had founded 20 years ago. The place where I had gotten sober 3 years earlier after nearly dying from a fentanyl overdose. The place where Dennis was currently abusing patients in ways that made my stomach turn. But before I could say anything, Dennis leaned forward and said, "Kyle, Rachel told me you've been acting paranoid lately, obsessing over things at the center. I'm worried you might be using again." The accusation hit exactly as he intended. Rachel's expression shifted from defensive to worried. I felt my face get hot but kept my voice level. "I'm not using. I have 3 years clean. You know that." Dennis nodded slowly, his eyes full of fake sympathy. "I know you believe that, but addicts often relapse without recognizing it. The paranoia, the accusations, the erratic behavior Rachel mentioned, these are classic signs." I looked at my wife. "What erratic behavior? What did you tell him?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "You've been staying late at the center, coming home and going straight to your office. You barely sleep. You're constantly on your phone. Kyle, you're scaring me." I had been documenting everything, recording conversations with Dennis's permission using the accountability app my sponsor made me install 3 years ago, taking photos of medical records I had access to as a volunteer counselor, writing detailed notes every single night about what I was seeing. But I could not explain that yet, not with Dennis watching me with that calculating expression. He was waiting for me to sound paranoid, to make wild accusations he could dismiss. So I stood up and said, "I'm not using. I'll take any drug test you want, anytime, but I came here to talk about something important, and I can see this isn't the right moment." Dennis stood too, walking around the desk to put his hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, almost painful. "Kyle, I care about you. Your family. If you're struggling, let me help you. Come in tomorrow morning and we'll do a full assessment. I can have you in a bed at the center by tomorrow afternoon if needed." He was trying to commit me, trying to get me locked in his facility where he controlled everything, where he could discredit anything I said as the ramblings of a relapsed addict, where I would have no access to the evidence I had been gathering. I pulled away from his grip and looked at Rachel. "I'm not using and I'm not crazy, but I need you to trust me right now." She looked between me and her father, and I saw her make the choice. "Maybe you should take the assessment, just to be safe." I left without another word. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel and trying to control my breathing. The panic attack was coming and I had to ride it out. This was what Dennis wanted, to isolate me, to make me look unstable. I pulled out my phone and called my sponsor, Jerry. He answered on the second ring. "Kyle, what's wrong?" I told him everything in a rush, what I had discovered at Thornton Recovery Center over the past 6 weeks. The way Dennis was over-medicating patients to keep them compliant. The financial records showing he was billing insurance for services never provided, pocketing hundreds of thousands of dollars. The patient complaints that were being buried. The young woman who had tried to report sexual assault during a counseling session and been discharged as non-compliant. Dennis had convinced Rachel I was paranoid and possibly using again. He was trying to have me committed. Jerry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You have evidence?" I did. 3 years of sobriety had taught me to document everything. My therapist made me keep a daily journal to track my emotions and triggers. My sponsor had me record our phone sessions for accountability. I had extended that to every interaction at the center once I started noticing problems. I had voice memos, photos, detailed written notes with dates and times. I had been building a case without even realizing it, using the same tools that kept me sober to expose what Dennis was doing. "I have everything," I told Jerry, "but no one will believe me. I'm a recovering addict and he's a respected addiction specialist. He founded that center. He's been on the board of 3 other treatment facilities. He does speaking engagements about ethical treatment practices." Jerry's voice was hard. "Then we make sure your evidence is so solid no one can ignore it. Come to my house right now. Bring everything you have." Jerry's house was in a modest neighborhood 40 minutes from mine. He had been sober for 15 years, worked as a contractor, and had walked me through the darkest period of my life when I was newly clean and wanted to die every single day. He met me at the door and pulled me into the kitchen where his wife Nina was waiting. Nina was a paralegal at a civil rights law firm. Jerry had already called her. I spread everything out on their kitchen table, printed emails I had accessed through the volunteer portal, showing Dennis instructing staff to increase medication dosages for patients who asked too many questions about their treatment plans, photos of financial records showing phantom therapy sessions, voice recordings of Dennis telling a female patient that crying during their sessions meant she wanted him to comfort her physically, written statements from 3 former patients I had tracked down who described similar abuse but never reported it because Dennis convinced them their addiction history meant no one would believe them. Nina read through everything with her lawyer face on, occasionally making notes. When she finished, she looked up at me. "This is solid, really solid. But you're right that going to the police directly might not work. Dennis has too much credibility, and you have history he'll use against you. We need to go to the state licensing board first, and we need corroboration. I felt hope for the first time in weeks. How do we get corroboration? Nina pulled out her laptop. We find other victims. Dennis has been running that center for 20 years. If he's doing this now, he's done it before. People like him don't suddenly start abusing power. They escalate over time. Somewhere out there are former patients or staff members who saw things, experienced things, but stayed quiet because they thought no one would believe them. We spent the next 4 hours searching. Nina had access to legal databases and public records. We found a lawsuit against the center from 8 years ago that had been settled confidentially. We found 3 former employees who had left abruptly. We found patient reviews on recovery forms that mentioned uncomfortable therapy sessions, but never explicitly stated abuse. I drove home after midnight. Rachel was still awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. Our daughter Emma was asleep upstairs. She was 2 years old and had never known me as anything other than sober. I had gotten clean before she was born, fought through withdrawal and early recovery while Rachel was pregnant, made it to the delivery room 93 days sober and shaking, but present. Emma was my reason for everything. Rachel looked up when I walked in. Where were you? I sat down across from her. With Jerry, planning how to handle this situation without making it worse. She looked exhausted. Dad called. He's worried about you. He said you have access to patient information at the center that you shouldn't be looking at. That's a violation, Kyle. You could lose your volunteer position. You could get in legal trouble. Of course Dennis had called her, laying groundwork, building his narrative. Rachel, I need you to listen to me for 5 minutes without interrupting. Can you do that? She hesitated, then nodded. I told her everything. Not in the frantic way I had told Jerry, but methodically, with specific examples and dates. I told her about David, a 23-year-old patient who had been at the center for 4 months, twice as long as his insurance approved, because Dennis kept billing for extended stays. About Christine, who had complained about unwanted touching during therapy and been discharged the next day with a notation in her file that she was sexually inappropriate with staff. About the medications, the falsified records, the systematic abuse of people too vulnerable to fight back. Rachel's face got paler as I talked. When I finished, she said, "These are serious accusations. If you're wrong, Dad could sue you for defamation. The center could lose its license over false reports. People depend on that place for treatment." I had known she would say that. I'm not wrong, and I have evidence. I showed her the photos on my phone, the voice recordings. She listened to Dennis's voice telling Christine that special therapy techniques might help her trauma, his tone intimate and predatory. Rachel's hands were shaking when the recording ended. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Why didn't you come to me first, before going to Jerry and Nina? Because I knew she would choose her father. Because Dennis had spent 30 years being her perfect dad, successful and caring and always there. Because my 3 years of sobriety could not compete with a lifetime of trust. But I did not say any of that. I'm coming to you now. I need to know if you believe me. Rachel stood up and walked to the window. She stared out at the dark street for a long time. Finally, she said, I believe you think this is happening. But my dad is a good man. He's dedicated his career to helping addicts. There has to be another explanation. That was not the same as believing me. I stood up too. I'm going to the state licensing board on Monday. I'm filing a formal complaint with evidence. After that, I'll probably go to the police. I wanted you to know first. Rachel turned around. If you do that, you'll destroy him. Even if the accusations are proven false, the damage will be done. Is that what you want? To ruin the man who helped save your life? The question was manipulative and she had to know it. Dennis had not saved my life. I had saved my own life by choosing recovery, by doing the work, by showing up to meetings and therapy, and sitting through the agony of withdrawal and early sobriety. Dennis had provided a facility and some counseling, but I had done the saving. I did not argue, though. I'm doing what's right. I hope you can support me, but I understand if you need time to process this. I went upstairs to check on Emma. She was sleeping peacefully, her small body curled around her stuffed rabbit. I kissed her forehead and whispered a promise that I would protect her from people who abused power, who used their positions to hurt vulnerable people, even if that person was her grandfather, even if it cost me everything. The next morning, Rachel was gone before I woke up. She had taken Emma with her. There was a note on the kitchen counter saying she needed space to think, and they were staying with her parents for a few days. My heart dropped into my stomach. Emma was at Dennis's house. The man I was about to accuse of systematic abuse had my daughter. I called Rachel immediately, but it went to voicemail. I called again and again. On the 4th call, she answered, her voice tight. Stop calling me. I forced myself to speak calmly. I need you to bring Emma home, right now. Rachel was quiet for a moment. She's fine. She's with her grandfather who loves her. We're safe here. The word safe hit me hard. She thought Emma needed to be safe from me. Dennis had gotten to her, convinced her I was unstable. Rachel, listen to me very carefully. I am sober. I am not a threat to you or Emma, but I need you to bring her home. I heard Dennis's voice in the background saying something I could not make out. Rachel said, "Dad thinks it would be best if you took that assessment. To prove you're okay. If you really have nothing to hide, why won't you do it?" Because the assessment would be conducted by Dennis or someone he controlled. Because he would fabricate results showing I was using or mentally unstable. Because once I was committed to his facility, I would lose all credibility and he could bury the evidence. I'll take any assessment from an independent facility, not Thornton, anywhere else. Rachel's voice got harder. That sounds like someone who has something to hide, Kyle. Dad's just trying to help. Why are you making this so difficult? I could feel the trap closing around me. If I refused the assessment, I looked guilty. If I accepted it at Dennis's facility, I was finished. I hung up and called Nina. She answered immediately, and I explained the situation. "He's isolating you," she said. "Classic abuser tactic, making you look unstable while positioning himself as the concerned helper. We need to move faster than planned. Can you come to my office right now?" I drove to Nina's law firm in downtown Seattle. She had already contacted a partner who specialized in medical malpractice and licensing issues. His name was Victor Reyes, and he listened to my story with the intense focus of someone who had heard worse, but still cared. When I finished, he said, "We file with the licensing board today. Emergency complaint with a request for immediate investigation. We'll also file for temporary custody of your daughter pending the investigation." The custody filing felt like defeat. Rachel and I had never fought like this. We had built a life together through my recovery, through pregnancy and new parenthood and all the normal struggles of marriage. Now I was filing legal papers against her. Victor saw my expression. "This protects Emma and protects you. If Dennis is as calculating as you say, he's going to use your daughter as leverage. He'll make Rachel believe you're dangerous. He might even try to get you arrested on false charges. We document everything starting now." We spent 6 hours in Victor's office preparing the complaint for the licensing board. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and cross-referenced. Every recording was transcribed. Every photo was annotated with dates and context. The complaint was 63 pages long and devastating. Victor filed it electronically at 4 in the afternoon. He also filed the emergency custody motion in family court. By 6, Dennis knew. He called my phone 17 times in 20 minutes. I did not answer. Then Rachel called, crying. "What did you do?" "Dad just got a notice from the state licensing board. They're opening an investigation." "Kyle, how could you? Do you know what this will do to him?" I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of Victor's building. The city was getting dark and cold, and I felt more alone than I had since early recovery. I did what I had to do. "Rachel, please bring Emma home. We can work through this, but I need you both home." Rachel's voice turned cold. "My father said you would do this. He said you'd make up stories, file false reports, try to destroy him because you blame him for your addiction. He said addicts always need someone else to blame." That was Dennis talking, his words coming out of my wife's mouth. "Rachel, I don't blame Dennis for my addiction. That was my choice and my responsibility. But what he's doing now is different. He's hurting people who trust him. I have evidence." She hung up. I sat in my car and tried not to spiral into panic. Jerry called and talked me through breathing exercises. Nina texted with updates. Victor sent an email saying the licensing board had flagged the complaint as urgent and assigned an investigator. I drove home to an empty house and forced myself to eat something. Then I did what I had done every night for 3 years. I opened my journal and wrote. The journal had been my therapist's idea when I was 90 days sober and barely holding on. She said I needed to externalize my thoughts, create a record of my recovery that I could look back on when I doubted myself. I had filled 9 journals since then, documenting every struggle and victory. Tonight I wrote about Rachel and Emma, about the fear that I was losing my family, about the knowledge that I was doing the right thing even if it cost me everything. Writing helped. It always did. It created distance between me and the emotions trying to drown me. When I finished, I recorded an audio journal entry too, speaking out loud about my fears and my resolve. Then I called Jerry and played it for him. Accountability. Always accountability. The next morning I went to the mandatory drug test Victor had scheduled. Independent lab, multiple substances tested, observed collection. The results would take 3 days, but would be admissible in court. From there, I went to my regular Narcotics Anonymous meeting. I had not missed a Monday morning meeting in 3 years. The group knew something was wrong immediately. I shared about the situation without naming Dennis or the center. Talked about doing the right thing when no one believed you, about staying sober through crisis. Afterward, 5 people approached me separately. 3 of them told me about experiences with treatment centers where counselors had crossed boundaries. 2 mentioned Thornton specifically. One woman, Kendra, said she had been a patient there 6 years ago. My counselor made me feel crazy, she said quietly. I tried to report that he was touching me inappropriately during sessions, and they discharged me for being disruptive. Said I was too sick for their program. I never told anyone else because I thought they'd say I was making it up. I asked if she would be willing to talk to Nina. She hesitated, then nodded. If it helped stop him from doing it to other people. By the time I left the meeting, I had 3 more potential witnesses. People who had been afraid to speak up because they thought their addiction history made them unreliable. People who had stayed silent because the shame was too heavy. people who needed someone else to go first. Nina interviewed all of them over the next 3 days. She recorded their statements and gathered what documentation they had. 2 had kept journals describing their experiences at the center. 1 had text messages from Dennis that were clearly inappropriate. The licensing board investigator called on Thursday. Her name was Angela Freeman, and she had been investigating treatment facilities for 12 years. She said my complaint was one of the most thoroughly documented she had ever seen. She was opening a full investigation and would be conducting site visits at Thornton Recovery Center. She also said Dennis had filed a counter-complaint alleging I had stolen patient records and violated confidentiality, that I was a disgruntled former patient making false accusations because of unresolved anger about my addiction. I expected that, I told her. I have evidence that I accessed those records through my legitimate volunteer portal. I have written authorization to record conversations for my own recovery accountability. Everything I've done is legal. Angela said she would review everything. In the meantime, Dennis was required to cooperate fully with the investigation or face immediate license suspension. That same day, the family court heard the emergency custody motion. Rachel showed up with a high-priced attorney Dennis had hired for her. The attorney argued I was mentally unstable, potentially using drugs, and filing false accusations against my father-in-law. He presented text messages from Rachel describing my recent behavior as erratic and obsessive. My drug test results came back clean. Victor submitted them along with character statements from Jerry, my therapist, my NA sponsor, and 3 other people from my recovery community. He also submitted my journals, 3 years of daily entries showing a stable, committed person working on his sobriety. The judge reviewed everything and made a temporary order. Emma would stay with Rachel pending the licensing board investigation, but Rachel had to move back to our house or to a neutral location. She could not keep Emma at Dennis's house. The judge said, "There are serious allegations under investigation. Until those are resolved, the child should not be in the home of the accused." Rachel left the courthouse in tears. That night, she came home with Emma. She went straight upstairs without speaking to me. I heard her in Emma's room, talking quietly to our daughter. I wanted to go up there, to hold them both, but I knew Rachel needed space. Instead, I stayed downstairs and prepared dinner. When Emma came down an hour later, she ran to me, shouting, "Daddy!" I picked her up and held her tight. She smelled like the baby shampoo we always used, and her hair was soft against my cheek. Rachel appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted and angry. "She needs to eat," she said flatly. We sat at the table in tense silence while Emma chattered about the dogs at Grandpa's house. When Emma asked why Mommy looked sad, Rachel said she was just tired. After dinner, I gave Emma her bath and read her 3 bedtime stories. She fell asleep holding my hand. I stayed there until I was sure she was deeply asleep, then went back downstairs. Rachel was in the living room staring at her phone. I sat down across from her. "I know you don't believe me yet, but I need you to know I'm not doing this to hurt your father. I'm doing it because what he's doing is wrong." Rachel looked up, her eyes red from crying. "He showed me your file, from when you were a patient. You were so sick, Kyle. You were suicidal and delusional, and you accused the staff of all kinds of things. You don't remember it because you were in withdrawal, but it's all documented. Dad says you're doing the same thing now, that the stress triggered old patterns and you can't tell reality from paranoia anymore." I felt cold. Dennis had shown her my patient file, violating confidentiality to build his case against me. What I said during withdrawal was different. I was detoxing from fentanyl and barely conscious. What I'm saying now is documented and corroborated. Other people have come forward with the same experiences. Rachel shook her head. "Dad said you'd say that you'd find other addicts to back up your story. He said addicts band together and reinforce each other's delusions." Every defense I offered, Dennis had already prepared her to dismiss it. I tried a different approach. "Rachel, have you ever wondered why your dad only treats addiction? Why he never expanded into other areas of psychology? Why he's so focused on that specific vulnerable population?" She frowned. "Because addiction treatment is his passion. He's good at it." I leaned forward. "Or because addicts make perfect victims. Because if they report abuse, people dismiss them as unreliable. Because their histories can be weaponized against them. Because society already doesn't believe them, so they're safe targets." Rachel stood up abruptly. "You're doing it again, twisting everything to fit your narrative. My dad is not a predator. He's a healer. He helped you get sober." She went upstairs before I could respond. I sat alone in the living room thinking about what Dennis had said during my intake 3 years ago. He had told me that recovery required absolute honesty, that I had to document everything, record my thoughts, create accountability. He had encouraged the very practices that were now being used against him. The irony was sharp. The next week was brutal. The licensing board investigation intensified. Angela Freeman conducted interviews with current and former staff at the center. She reviewed financial records and medical files. She interviewed patients. Dennis hired a team of lawyers who accused the board of bias and procedural violations. They filed motions to dismiss the investigation and suppress evidence. In the middle of this, Dennis showed up at our house. I was outside with Emma, letting her play in the small yard while I watched from the porch. A black Mercedes pulled up and Dennis got out. He walked up the driveway in his expensive suit, his face a mask of concern. "Kyle, can we talk? Man to man?" I picked up Emma and held her against my hip. "You need to leave." Dennis held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I understand you're angry. This whole situation has gotten out of hand, but I'm here to offer you a solution. Drop the complaint with the licensing board and I'll make sure you get the help you need. Full treatment at a facility in Arizona, top quality care, all expenses paid. Rachel and Emma can visit regularly. You come back in 6 months clean and healthy, and we all move forward." He was trying to exile me, send me away where I could not pursue the investigation, where he could control the narrative. "I don't need treatment. I'm sober and I'm going to stay that way. What I need is for you to face consequences for what you've done to your patients." Dennis's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. You're destroying your family over delusions. Rachel is already talking to divorce attorneys. Do you want to lose your daughter?" The threat was clear. He would use his influence and resources to help Rachel take Emma away from me, paint me as unstable, use my addiction history against me in custody proceedings. "Get off my property," I said quietly. Dennis stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You were nothing when you came to my center. A junkie who had overdosed 3 times. I gave you structure and hope and purpose. This is how you repay me? With lies and accusations?" I pulled out my phone and started recording. "I'm asking you again to leave. You're trespassing." Dennis noticed the phone, and his face flushed with anger. "Recording me without permission is illegal in Washington state. That's a felony, Kyle. Are you really that stupid?" He was wrong. Washington required 2-party consent for private conversations, but not for conversations on your own property where there was no expectation of privacy. I knew this because Victor had briefed me extensively on recording laws. "You're on my property without permission. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Dennis stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his car. Before getting in, he called back, "You're going to regret this. I promise you that." I took Emma inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking and my heart was racing. I called Victor and sent him the recording. He said it was good evidence of intimidation, that Dennis was spiraling, making mistakes. That meant the investigation was getting close to something real. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Angela Freeman called and said she needed to meet with me immediately. I drove to her office downtown and she pulled me into a conference room where 2 other investigators were waiting. "We found the financial records," Angela said. "Dennis has been overbilling insurance companies for years. Phantom therapy sessions, extended stays that were never approved, kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies for overprescribing medication. We're talking about fraud in the millions of dollars." One of the other investigators, a man named Robert, added, "We also found NDA settlements with at least 7 former patients. Sexual misconduct allegations that were paid off and buried. Dennis used center funds to pay them, which means he was embezzling to cover up abuse." My stomach turned. It was worse than I had documented. Angela continued, "We're referring this to the criminal division. The Attorney General's office will be opening a criminal investigation. Dennis will likely be arrested within the week." I felt dizzy. This had moved beyond a licensing board complaint into criminal territory. "What happens to the patients currently at the center?" Angela said they would be transferred to other facilities. The center would be shut down immediately. Staff would be interviewed as potential witnesses. Dennis's medical license would be suspended, pending criminal charges. I asked about Rachel and Emma. Angela's expression softened. "Your wife needs to know this is real. Would you like us to brief her with you present?" I called Rachel from Angela's office. She answered coldly. I told her the licensing board needed to meet with both of us, and it was urgent. She arrived an hour later with her attorney. Angela laid out the findings in devastating detail. She showed Rachel the financial records, the NDA settlements, the patient complaints that had been buried. She played recordings of Dennis telling staff to increase medication for patients who asked too many questions. Rachel sat frozen as the evidence piled up. Her attorney took notes, his expression getting grimmer. When Angela finished, Rachel said, "This can't be real. You're all conspiring against him." Angela slid a document across the table. "This is an NDA your father paid $75,000 for 5 years ago. The patient alleged sexual assault during therapy. Your father used center funds to pay it, then created fake invoices to cover the expense. That's fraud and embezzlement." Rachel read the document, her hands shaking. Then she looked at me. "Did you know about this?" I shook my head. "I found some of it, but not all of this, not the extent." She started crying. Not the angry crying from before, but broken, devastated crying. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder and suggested they step outside. They left for 10 minutes. When they came back, Rachel's face was pale but composed. "What happens now?" Angela explained the criminal investigation timeline. Dennis would be arrested and charged. There would be a trial. Patients would be contacted and offered the opportunity to provide statements. The center would be permanently closed and assets would be seized. Rachel asked, "Is Kyle in any legal trouble for accessing patient records?" Angela said no. Everything I had done was within the bounds of my volunteer authorization and recovery accountability practices. I had not stolen anything or violated any laws. After the meeting, Rachel and I walked to our cars in silence. Before we separated, she turned to me. "I should have believed you. I'm sorry." I wanted to feel vindicated, but I just felt sad. Your dad is a good liar. That's what made him dangerous. Rachel wiped her eyes. I need some time to process all of this, but I don't want to keep Emma from you. That was wrong. We worked out a temporary schedule. Emma would stay with me half the week and with Rachel at her sister's house the other half. Rachel did not want to be at our house, where we had built our life based on lies about her father. Dennis was arrested 3 days later at his home. The local news covered it extensively. Prominent addiction specialist arrested on fraud and sexual abuse charges. The story detailed the financial crimes and the patient allegations. Dennis's lawyers held a press conference declaring his innocence and blaming vindictive former patients and disgruntled staff. The day after Dennis's arrest, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside were copies of patient records from 8 years ago. Records I had never seen. They documented Dennis's treatment of a 17-year-old patient named Aaron, who had died of an overdose 2 weeks after being discharged from the center. Aaron's parents had tried to sue, claiming negligence, but the case had been settled confidentially. The records showed Dennis had given Aaron a prescription for pain medication days before discharge, despite knowing Aaron was in recovery for opioid addiction. I called Angela immediately. She said they were already investigating Aaron's death as part of the expanded criminal case. Someone inside the center, probably a staff member with a conscience, was leaking documents to investigators and victims. Over the next month, the case exploded. 12 more former patients came forward with allegations of abuse. Staff members provided testimony about Dennis's practices. Financial forensic accountants traced the fraud back 15 years. The total was estimated at over $4 million. Dennis's lawyers tried every tactic. They claimed the investigation was biased, that I had orchestrated a conspiracy, that the patients were unreliable witnesses. The prosecution methodically demolished each argument with documentary evidence and corroborating testimony. 6 months after I filed the initial complaint, Dennis went to trial. I testified for 4 hours, walking the jury through what I had discovered and documented. The defense attorney tried to discredit me by focusing on my addiction history, reading excerpts from my patient file describing my state during withdrawal. But Victor had prepared me for this. I calmly explained the difference between acute withdrawal and stable recovery. I submitted my 3 years of clean drug tests. I presented my journals showing consistent, rational thought patterns. The jury watched me with attention and respect. Other victims testified too. Kendra described Dennis's inappropriate touching during therapy sessions. David explained how Dennis had kept him at the center for months, beyond his insurance approval, racking up personal debt. A former staff member named Lisa testified about being instructed to falsify records and intimidate patients who complained. The most damaging testimony came from the forensic accountant who detailed the fraud. Millions of dollars billed for services never provided, kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies, embezzled funds used to pay off victims. Dennis had built an empire on exploiting vulnerable people. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 8 hours, guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, sexual assault, practicing medicine while impaired, and 11 other charges. Dennis showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His lawyers immediately filed for appeal. The sentencing hearing was 2 months later. Victims were allowed to give impact statements. I stood in front of the judge and told him what Dennis's abuse of power had cost. Not just the financial fraud or the physical assault of patients, but the betrayal of trust that made vulnerable people afraid to seek help. The damage he had done to the entire concept of addiction treatment. I ended by saying, I got sober despite Dennis Thornton, not because of him. And I stayed sober by using the very tools he taught me to document his crimes. That's the irony he'll have to live with. The judge sentenced Dennis to 23 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 15. He would be 78 years old if he survived that long. The center's assets were liquidated to pay restitution to victims and defrauded insurance companies. Dennis's medical license was permanently revoked. He would never practice again. Rachel filed for divorce while Dennis was awaiting sentencing. She was devastated by everything that had come out at trial. She had spent 3 decades loving a father who turned out to be a monster. She went into therapy and started processing the revelation that the man who raised her had been hurting people for years. Our relationship was complicated after everything. We tried couples counseling, but Rachel could not separate me from the trauma of discovering who her father really was. We decided on an amicable divorce with shared custody of Emma. We sold the house and bought smaller places near each other so Emma could have stability. 3 years after Dennis's arrest, I got a call from a producer at a documentary series about medical fraud. They wanted to feature Dennis's case and asked if I would participate. I agreed on the condition that they focused on the victims and the systemic failures that let him operate for so long. The documentary aired 8 months later. It featured interviews with 12 victims, staff members who had been afraid to speak up, and investigators who detailed the financial crimes. I appeared briefly, explaining how my sobriety practices had given me the tools to document abuse. The documentary sparked policy changes. Washington state passed new oversight requirements for addiction treatment facilities. Insurance companies implemented stricter auditing procedures. Professional boards created better reporting systems for patient complaints. Dennis's empire of abuse had finally created something positive from its ashes. I still see Rachel regularly at Emma's school events and custody exchanges. We're civil, sometimes even friendly. She's rebuilding her life and dealing with the trauma of her father's betrayal. Emma is 7 now and knows her grandfather is in prison, but doesn't know why. We'll tell her the truth when she's older, when she can understand abuse of power and the importance of speaking up, even when people don't believe you. Last week was my 6-year sobriety anniversary. My NA group celebrated with cake and applause. Jerry gave a speech about how my recovery had saved more lives than just my own, how my willingness to risk everything to expose corruption had protected countless future patients. After the meeting, a young man approached me. He was maybe 22, skinny and nervous. "I just got out of a treatment center," he said. "The counselor there was doing things that felt wrong. I didn't know if I should say anything because of my history, but then I heard about what you did, about how you used your sobriety to prove you were telling the truth. So I reported him. They're investigating now." I shook his hand and told him he was brave, that his voice mattered regardless of his past. That recovery wasn't just about getting clean, it was about becoming someone who stood up for what was right. He thanked me and walked away. I stood in the church parking lot where the meeting was held and thought about everything that had happened. Dennis had tried to use my addiction history to make me unbelievable, to silence me before I could expose him. Instead, my sobriety had given me the discipline and documentation to build an irrefutable case. The same tools that kept me clean had brought down a predator. Jerry came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Kyle. You proved that recovery makes people stronger, not weaker. That sobriety gives you clarity, not confusion. Dennis thought your past would protect him. Instead, it destroyed him." We walked to our cars together. I had dinner plans with Emma tonight, and Rachel was dropping her off at my apartment in an hour. Tomorrow, I was volunteering at a different recovery center, one with proper oversight and ethical practices. Life had moved forward. The damage Dennis had caused would never fully heal for his victims, but justice had been done. The system had eventually worked because someone with an addiction history had refused to stay silent, had used his sobriety as proof instead of shame, and had let the truth speak louder than stigma. 5 years ago, I had been a junkie overdosing in an alley. Now I was the man who brought down a corrupt empire. Recovery had made that possible. Sobriety had made me believable. And Dennis Thornton would spend the rest of his life knowing that the very person he thought he could silence had been the one to destroy him. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.